Right then guys, I'm here with the most outdated and pointless all seasons of career mode video I've ever made. I started recording this video on version 1.04 of the game and ended it on version 1.10. Everything from the initial pecking order to the rate at which teams improved has been altered since this career started. As such, this career mode is now irrepeatable and meaningless. For the first time ever in an all seasons career, I took part in quite a few races. Since the pecking order changed so frequently and since we had drivers moving to teams they would never race for in the real world, I thought it'd be fun to take part in every single Australian Grand Prix. That will be released later as its own separate video where I talk about how a 50% distance Australian Grand Prix played out in each of the 10 seasons. With all of that out of the way, let's get into my career, which I spent with the current slowest team, Williams. Thanks to the new and arguably overpowered Simulate Practice feature, I didn't have to bother with practice, but I did have to bother with the other sessions. That's because it's easier to get sacked in this game compared to F1 2018, so I had to do some qualifying sessions and races to be able to stay with Williams. On F1 2018, I got sacked just before the end of the second season. On F1 2019, I initially got sacked after just one season. So the season where Hamilton won the Drivers' Championship and Mercedes won the Constructors isn't canonical since I restarted the career after I was fired. It's a shame it doesn't count because that's the same season where Stroll went to Renault and destroyed the team just by being there. But I've already talked about that and much more besides in my 5 seasons of driver changes video. At the Austrian Grand Prix in the first canonical season, Hülkenberg and Grosjean swapped teams. It seems odd that Hülkenberg would leave Renault to join Haas, especially given that his season was going well. But he went there because Haas had just overtaken Renault to have the quicker car. Come the end of the season, Sebastian Vettel won the Drivers' Championship and he did so with a race to spare. You'd think that's a turn up for the books, but you've got to remember that on version 1.04 Ferrari and Mercedes had identically quick cars. Since then, Codemasters have updated the car performances so that Mercedes have by far the better one. This isn't the only time the old car performances will come up in this video since I ran on version 1.04 until the start of season 5. Anyway, Vettel got the better of Hamilton by 39 points and Charles Leclerc beat Bottas by 9 points, meaning Ferrari comfortably took the Constructors' Championship. Verstappen finished in 5th with 200 points and Gasly in 6th with 40 less. Sergio Perez won the Formula 1.5 battle with now Haas driver Hülkenberg in 8th. The former Renault driver beat his old teammate by 27 points, despite the fact that they were level on points pre-Austria. Magnussen scored 10 points at Haas in the same time it took Grosjean to score 6 at Renault. Grosjean was the lowest ranked driver to score any points, as neither Alfa Romeo, Toro Rosso or Williams driver accrued any. The Constructors' Championship has already largely been spoken for, with Ferrari beating Mercedes by 48 points. However, Renault still beat Haas, despite Hülkenberg beating Ricciardo and Magnussen beating Grosjean. That's because 32 of Hülkenberg's 82 points were scored for Renault, and Ricciardo thrashing both Magnussen and Grosjean meant Renault did enough to beat Haas, despite ending the season with the slower car. In fact, come the end of the season, Renault had a slower car than Haas and even Racing Point. McLaren had just overtaken Red Bull to have the third quickest car on the grid, and Ferrari and Mercedes kept leapfrogging each other in terms of development, but more often than not, Ferrari had the quicker car. Like in the previous F1 games, I focused on buying all of the discount upgrades for each department and buying varying amounts of quality control upgrades. It's the same approach I adopted in F1 2018 for exactly the same reasons. Buying the discounts is the fastest way to upgrade your car and therefore the fastest way to reach your car's peak. Once you factor in rule changes, the discounts make even more sense. Speaking of which, there was a rule change for Season 2, but only in the durability department. For Season 2, Max Verstappen and Lando Norris swapped seats. It's a move that Verstappen definitely initiated, given that McLaren ended the first season with a quicker car than Red Bull and started the second season still in front of them. Also during the off-season, Renault were passed by Toro Rosso and Racing Point were jumped by the pair of them. Vettel was leading the Drivers' Championship after the 6th race of the season. 1 round later in Canada, Ferrari lost the Constructors' Championship lead to Mercedes, after Leclerc finished the Canadian Grand Prix in 12th. The German Grand Prix set the tone for the rest of the season, as the podium was made up by both Toro Rossos and Hülkenberg for Haas, who won the race. Then at Hungary, Kevin Magnussen won the race, with Sainz second, Hülkenberg third, Verstappen for McLaren fourth, and then both Toro Rossos who lead Norris in a Red Bull and then Hamilton. Sounds odd, but with the fast-paced world of Formula 1, Haas had the best car with McLaren the second best and Toro Rosso the third. That unrealistically fast rate of development was patched out in version 1.09, which is one of the many reasons this career mode can't be repeated. Mercedes still won the Constructors' Championship in Japan after taking a 1-2 finish, despite only having the third best car at that point in time. At the same venue he famously won his first title back in 2008, Lewis Hamilton won the Drivers' Championship, taking the possibility away from his teammate Valtteri Bottas. At the end of the second season, Hamilton beat Bottas by 65 points, with Hülkenberg for Haas third in the championship. Verstappen overtook Vettel for 4th at the final race, and then it's the other Haas driver of Magnussen in 6th. Albon was the leading Toro Rosso driver with Sainz, Kvyat and Leclerc rounding out the top 10. Norris had almost twice as many points as his Red Bull teammate Gasly, and then it's both Racing Points with Perez who scored 22 points and Stroll with 2. Daniel Ricciardo scored Renault's only point of the season, meaning Grosjean along with both Alfa Romeo and Williams drivers scored no points at all. Mercedes won the Constructors' Championship despite ending the season with a slower car than Haas, who ended the season second in the championship. McLaren ended in third and Toro Rosso, who had the quickest car come the end, only finished in 5th and behind Ferrari. Toro Rosso and Haas had much quicker cars than the competition, with McLaren away behind the top 2 but noticeably ahead of Mercedes. Ferrari were closer to Alfa Romeo in terms of development than they were to the very front, and Red Bull weren't faring any better. The third season is where it all kicked off. Hamilton and Vettel are now teammates and driving for Toro Rosso. Bottas has gone to Haas, Albon has gone to Ferrari, and finally Kvyat and Magnussen are both Mercedes drivers. I couldn't possibly talk about every single race I took part in, but the British Grand Prix is worthy of a mention. This was done on version 1.04, so back when the AI were too slow in the wet. I started down in 20th, thanks to grid penalties, but I was in the company of a lot of top drivers who unexpectedly started at the back due to changeable weather in Q1. I was able to pass my way up to 13th, and Ricciardo's spin put me in 12th at the start of the third lap. Vettel in the Toro Rosso was much quicker than me though, so put me back down into 13th. What ended up happening was, around halfway into the race, most of the grid pitted onto intermediates, but lots of the drivers who were running up at the front didn't want to risk losing track position, so stayed on the same set of wet tyres for the whole race. That didn't completely work out for them as Hamilton and the Toro Rosso took the race lead away from Kvyat in the Mercedes. The AI's lack of pace meant after the pit stops I was able to fairly easily overtake Kimi Räikkönen and even Pierre Gasly, which took me up to 11th. Lando Norris was too far up the road for me to catch up to him, but then he overtook Leclerc, who was still on the wets. That meant I had 5 laps to close down a 12-second lead. I was able to catch up to him on the start of the final lap, but I still had to make a move on a Ferrari with this awful Williams. Under braking for Brooklands though, I had the inside line and more grip, so I was able to take the final points place away from Charles Leclerc. Given another few laps I could have had his teammate Alexander Albon as well, but this was my personal as well as Williams' first point of the career. The podium was a particularly strange one as okay sure, both Hamilton and Vettel were there, but they were there as Toro Rosso drivers and as teammates. The other driver is Danny Kvyat, but at least he's driving for a team you would expect to get podium finishes. After the summer break there was another driver swap, as Sainz went to Haas, replacing Hülkenberg, who now partners Verstappen. I don't know how Franz Tost convinced Hamilton and Vettel to be teammates and a Toro Rosso of all teams, but it paid off as they secured the Constructors' Championship in Japan with 4 races still to go. They did that despite having a marginally slower car than Haas and McLaren, but it's the drivers that made all the difference, and a Toro Rosso 1-2 led by Hamilton at the Japanese Grand Prix affirmed that. Just 2 rounds later, Toro Rosso claimed their first ever driver's title as Hamilton became a 7 times world champion. He beat Vettel by 81 points. So finally we get the ideal situation of Hamilton and Vettel together at the same team, and the competition was disappointingly one-sided. Bottas ended the season 3rd with Hülkenberg, Haas, then McLaren in 4th with Sainz in 5th and 43 points ahead of Verstappen in 6th. That's bigger than the 8-point gap that existed between them prior to the team switch. Both Mercedes drivers finished in 7th and 8th with Kvyat and Magnussen separated by only 2 points, and then it's the 2 Ferrari drivers in 9th and 10th, except Leclerc got over double the points of Albon. Norris for Red Bull scored 6 points, and then it's Perez with 2, and then myself and Gasly both scored a single point across the season. Both Renault and Alfa Romeo drivers had pointless seasons along with Stroll and Kubica. Toro Rosso romped home with a 245-point Constructors' Championship lead over Haas and 500 points over McLaren. The Red Bull Junior team, who ironically fielded 2 of the oldest drivers on the grid, miraculously beat Mercedes, Ferrari and even the main Red Bull team. Toro Rosso actually ended the 3rd season with only the 5th quickest car, which shows just how important having a strong driver lineup is. Mercedes and Ferrari caught up to the front at the very end, with Ferrari having the last laugh and ending as the quickest team, even though the race results don't really back that up. Their mistake though was to carry on developing whilst everyone else didn't, or perhaps even couldn't. At the Italian Grand Prix, a rule change for the chassis and aero departments was announced, and at around that time every team slowed down or stopped developing except Mercedes and Ferrari. Unsurprisingly, they lost more performance heading into season 4 than any of the other teams did. Williams were the only team to improve during that time frame, as I adapted all of the upgrades we bought up to that point, and even purchased another 5 in time for the Australian Grand Prix. McLaren lost by far the least performance, so went from having one of the quickest cars to the best by a country mile. There was only one driver transfer between seasons, and that was Vettel, clearly disgruntled after being trounced by Hamilton, made a backwards move as he left Toro Rosso to go back to Ferrari, which have the slower car. It also means Albon is back at Toro Rosso. The writing was on the wall by the time the Russian Grand Prix rolled around, as Hamilton had a 75 points lead over Hülkenberg and 89 over his former teammate Bottas. Despite the runaway success, Hamilton still decided to leave Toro Rosso before the end of the season and rejoin Mercedes in time for the Japanese Grand Prix. The lack of loyalty from some of the drivers on the grid is astounding, especially as Hamilton had still yet to finish a race that season off the podium. Sure, his form dipped from getting 6 straight race wins to getting a few second place finishes, but why leave a team you've had such great success with just because your old team has repassed them in terms of car development? Lewis Hamilton won his 3rd Drivers' Championship in this video and celebrated his win with the Mercedes team, despite the fact most of the work done towards that title was with Toro Rosso. The fickleness of the drivers in this game is breathtaking, and the fact Hamilton didn't even recognise Toro Rosso's work towards his personal title is the most disrespectful thing you'll see in this video. Hamilton's absence at Toro Rosso hurt the team badly, with his replacement Magnussen only finishing 6th at COTA and Albon down in 10th. Just 2 races ago, Toro Rosso led the Constructors' Championship. Now they've been jumped by McLaren, and both of those were passed by Haas, who lead the Constructors' Championship by 6 points. Lewis Hamilton completed the 21 race season, finishing on the podium at every single event. He's now an 8 times world champion, even eclipsing Schumacher's 7. Haas's strong end to the season saw Bottas take the runner-up spot in the championship, again after beating Hülkenberg by 64 points. Hulk's teammate Verstappen finished in 4th, and then Bottas' own teammate Carlos Sainz was blown out the water by the former Mercedes man, as Sainz couldn't even break the 200-point barrier. Albon finished 6th in the championship, only beating Vettel by 3 points, and his new teammate Magnussen by 8. Magnussen closed down the gap between himself and Albon since the two became teammates, and Kvyat caught up to Magnussen by sticking around at Mercedes. Leclerc became the clear number 2 at Ferrari with less than a third of the points of Vettel, and then it's just Perez who scored 6 points and Raikkonen who got 1 point back at the first race of the season. But the Finn had a fair few 11th and 12th place finishes, so was close to nabbing a few more points. Astonishingly, neither Renault or Red Bull driver scored any points. The same is also true for both Williams, Lance Stroll and finally Antonio Giovinazzi. Haas took their first Constructors' Championship in what was a remarkably close championship battle, with McLaren just 22 points adrift and Toro Rosso in 3rd and only 35 points off the top. Hamilton's new team finished directly behind his old one, and then it's a steep drop down from Ferrari's 192 points to Racing Point's 6. Williams finished ahead of Renault in the championship, presumably thanks to my 11th place finish in the British Grand Prix. A powertrain rule change sought to mix up the grid, but Williams are safe as I adapted every single one of the current upgrades. That meant we stopped developing earlier than most other teams and had Alfa Romeo and Racing Point repass us. For Season 5, 2 direct driver swaps took place. Albon went to Mercedes to partner up alongside Hamilton again, with Kvyat going back to his old stomping ground of Toro Rosso. Also, Grosjean and Raikkonen swapped seats, which means Grosjean is now at Alfa Romeo and Raikkonen at Renault. Every single team dropped in performance from the 4th to 5th season, except McLaren, who stayed on the same level, and Williams, who improved to have the 6th best car on the grid. Ferrari lost a gigantic amount of ground, presumably every single powertrain upgrade, as their car is now only marginally better than Williams and has the 2nd worst power unit of any car. It was after the Bahrain Grand Prix I installed version 1.05. That's the patch that updated the car performances and changed the default running order from this to this. It also turned McLaren from the top team to the dominant team. Also, as a result of that update, Toro Rosso passed Mercedes, Williams dropped behind Alfa Romeo, and Red Bull swapped places with Renault, so the French team now has the slowest car in Formula 1. I talked about this in the driver changes video, but on version 1.04 Hülkenberg was the quicker McLaren driver, hence the extra 62 points in Season 4, and the fact that Hülkenberg finished ahead of Verstappen in both the Australian and Bahrain Grand Prix in Season 5. That wasn't the only inter-team dynamic to change as a result of the update, but since I covered the rest of them in the driver changes video, I want to focus on the all-important McLaren inter-team battle. Before we get into that, I need to talk about one race in particular. Amazingly, I finished the Belgian Grand Prix in 10th, so that's my first point scored in an all-dry race, and only my 2nd one in the career to date. It was essentially the power advantage I had over the rest of the field that gave me a shot at a point. I even passed Sebastian Vettel in the Ferrari with ease. That's how down on power the Ferrari still was. I moved up to 11th on raw pace, and then Carlos Sainz retiring from the race promoted me into 10th. I took a point away from the Belgian Grand Prix, and given a few more laps it could have been 2 as I was slowly catching up to Daniel Ricciardo. This was the last time I had a hope in hell of beating a Renault, because out of nowhere at the very next race they announced they had the 3rd best car in Formula 1. It wasn't that long ago they had the slowest car. That's how quickly teams improved on older versions of the game, and even by those standards, Renault's rate of development was phenomenal. In the simmed Italian Grand Prix, me and Kubica only beat Lando Norris in a Red Bull. That's a race at a power circuit and with a car that outpowers almost everything else. We could only beat one driver. That's despite the fact we have a better engine and car overall than Red Bull, Ferrari and Racing Point. I fitted the final performance upgrade in time for the Singapore Grand Prix. That means the team won't be competing for any championships, unlike in every all seasons of career mode video stretching back to F1 2016. Williams have peaked, and by the time we did it, we've only got the 7th best car to show for it. The other teams just developed their cars way too quickly before version 1.09 was released. In time for the Japanese Grand Prix, George Russell has finally entered F1 and joined Ferrari. That means Leclerc has joined Renault and Raikkonen is out of F1 entirely. Leclerc had scored 37 points with Ferrari that season and only one less than Vettel. But the move to Renault paid off immediately as Leclerc scored 12 points in Japan and Vettel only 2. Although Vettel's 2 points is better than Russell's 0 and 13th place finish in his debut Formula 1 race. Finally, shout out to Alexander Albon who finished in 2nd and split the two McLarens, whilst Hamilton, in what is at this point the fastest car, only finished in 5th. That's another one of the teammate dynamics that changed radically after version 1.05, as Hamilton utterly crushed Albon last year and even during the first 2 races of this year. Max Verstappen won the Drivers' Championship in Mexico, and in doing so becomes the 3rd different driver to win the championship in this career. 2 races later, Racing Point inexplicably jumped up from having the 7th best car to the 3rd best. Not like you'd notice, given that the team only scored 16 points all season and none of them were attained whilst they had the supposedly ultra-competitive car. Max Verstappen beat Nico Hülkenberg by 146 points come the end of the season. That's all well and good, but we all know that had I not updated the game this season, it would have been Hülkenberg's championship for sure. The 2 Mercedes drivers are next, and Hamilton only outscored his teammate Albon by 7 points. Once you factor in the fact Albon's car broke down during the Spanish Grand Prix, whilst ahead of Hamilton, the 2 drivers had identically good seasons. Carlos Sainz led a Haas 5-6, and then Kvyat beat Magnussen in the Toro Rosso battle. Charles Leclerc had a stellar end to the season. When he joined Renault, he had 1 point less than Vettel and 1 point more than Ricciardo. He ended the season with 55 more than the Aussie and 57 more than his former teammate. Perez's 14 points represent the vast majority of Racing Points total, and then it's Raikkonen with 11, Giovinazzi with 3, Stroll 2, Russell and myself 1 each, and then it's Kubica, the Alfa Romeo driver of Grosjean, and then both Red Bull drivers of Gasly and Norris scoring no points. McLaren obliterated the competition as they scored 838 points, more than double that of runners-up Mercedes. Haas finished in 3rd, Toro Rosso 4th, Renault 5th, and ahead of Ferrari thanks to their exceptional mid-season development and ditching Raikkonen in favour of Leclerc. Every team scored a point, except for, unbelievably, Red Bull. Red Bull ended the season with such an inferior car compared to everyone else's that it's a bit of a joke. For the 6th season, Sergio Perez went to Mercedes to partner Hamilton, whilst Albon went to Racing Point to take Perez's old seat. Daniel Ricciardo went to Haas to replace Sainz, and Vettel took Ricciardo's seat at Renault. Carlos Sainz took the 2nd Racing Point seat, so he'll be teammates with another former Toro Rosso driver. That left only 1 seat available, which was the 2nd Ferrari seat, which was taken by Raikkonen. So Raikkonen came back to F1 after leaving the sport for 5 races. That means the now 44-year-old is back racing again, and so Lance Stroll has been forced out entirely. Stroll's absence is ridiculous, given that he's the only person whose spot in Formula 1 is guaranteed, since his dad owns an F1 team. I'll jump forward all the way to the Hungarian Grand Prix, which was won by Lando Norris, with his teammate Gasly in 5th, despite the Red Bull still being the 2nd worst car on the grid and only better than ours. That's a result that came out of nowhere, with the only indication that was going to happen being Gasly's surprise podium at Hockenheim. Before then, Red Bull had only scored 6 points all season. However, just before the German Grand Prix, I installed version 1.08. In fact, I jumped straight from version 1.06 to 1.08 and never played on 1.07. Even still, there's nothing in either of those patches that explains how Red Bull can win a race with the 9th best car. It was in Sochi, Russia that Max Verstappen won his second Drivers' Championship, with 5 races, just under a quarter of the season still to go. Every race after then saw both Red Bull drivers on the podium together, and all of those races, bar the Mexican Grand Prix, were 1-2 finishes. That's unsurprising since, by that point, Red Bull had developed their car to such an extent that it was the class leader. Sergio Perez was the surprise runner-up this season as he got the better of Hülkenberg by 20 points. But even still, he ended the season 183 points off the top, over 7 race wins worth of points away from Verstappen. Hülkenberg finished in 3rd with the new wonder kid of Lando Norris in 4th, overtaking Leclerc at the final race. Gasly bested both racing points, who amazingly, despite having varied and often contrasting finishing records, averaged out to do similarly well across the season. Lewis Hamilton scraped into the top 10, but this was the first season where he was beaten by a teammate, and Perez didn't just beat him, he wiped the floor with him. George Russell did a similar thing to Kimi Raikkonen, as Russell, in his first full season, scored 101 points. Raikkonen only 9. Russell scored more than that in the Italian Grand Prix alone. The only race where Raikkonen finished higher than Russell was the Russian Grand Prix, and that's only because Russell didn't finish at all. Giovinazzi scored 8 points for Alfa Romeo whilst Grosjean got none, and to the surprise of no one, neither myself nor Kubica nabbed any points. McLaren won the Constructors' Championship by exactly 300 points over Mercedes. Red Bull ended the season in 3rd and only 4 points short of Mercedes total. Let's not forget that prior to version 1.08 they had only scored 6 points. Or since the updates may have nothing to do with it, let me phrase it this way. Red Bull had only scored 6 points from the start of the season up to the end of the British Grand Prix. That's 6 points in the first half of the season, yet they scored 341 in the second half. Given another race, they would have beaten Mercedes for sure. The 7th season started off with 4 big name driver changes. With Red Bull now the team to beat, 2 drivers rushed their way in, and it almost seems like the existing driver lineup couldn't stop it from happening despite being the ones who ushered in the team's change in fortune. Even Norris, with his 3 consecutive race wins, wasn't safe, as Hülkenberg and Bottas took the 2 most desired seats in F1. Gasly took Hülkenberg's old seat at McLaren to partner up alongside Verstappen again, and Norris went to Haas to be teammates with Daniel Ricciardo. I can pretty much jump straight to the end of the season, but I do need to point out that another driver change happened mid-season. In time for the Austrian Grand Prix, Sainz and Hülkenberg swapped seats. Sainz now races for Red Bull and Hülkenberg for Racing Point. That's the second time those 2 drivers directly traded seats, as they did the same thing in the middle of the 3rd season. Both drivers have also moved around a lot. Sainz is now on his 4th different team, whilst Hülkenberg is on his 5th. Whilst at Spa-Francorchamps, an end of season rule change was confirmed, and it's a big one as it affects the aerodynamics, chassis and durability departments. By this point in time though, I had saved up over 14,000 resource points, so I was able to adapt all of the performance altering upgrades there and then. Max Verstappen became a triple world champion long before the end of the season. In fact, it's the 2nd year in a row he took the title in Russia. McLaren secured the Constructors' Championship 1 race later in Japan. Despite McLaren spending the entire season with the 4th best car, they took a 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship, with Verstappen beating Gasly by 198 points. Red Bull, with the quickest car on the grid, were in actuality the 2nd best team, as Bottas finished in 3rd and Sainz ended with 16 points less than the Finn, despite joining the team with 47 fewer. Sergio Perez for Mercedes finished in 5th, with Leclerc in 6th and as the leading Renault driver for the second year in a row, and Norris pipped old Formula 2 rival Russell at the final race. George Russell scored 101 points more than his vastly more experienced teammate, and that's the story of the season, younger drivers beating their older teammates. On the surface, the Racing Point team battle is different, but Hülkenberg scored 82 of his 87 points whilst at Red Bull. In the same time he scored 5 points for Racing Point, Albon scored 47. Lewis Hamilton's poor season is the biggest story by far, as he was beaten by teammate Perez again. In the past, he's been in the same team as Bottas, Vettel, Kvyat, Albon twice as he raced alongside him at both Toro Rosso and Mercedes, yet none of them ever got the better of him. Perez beat Hamilton last year and he did so again, and this time by an even bigger margin. The Constructors' Championship is already largely spoken for, but what's strange about it is that it doesn't line up at all with the supposed pecking order of the cars. You see, the reason I could summarise this season so succinctly is the same reason a major rule change was desperately needed. Every single team maxed out their car at the end of the previous season, meaning the teams were all at a standstill this year. What is new to this year's game, and it's a fantastic change, is that the maximum performance level all the teams can reach isn't dependent on how quick they start off, or even consistent throughout a career. For example, Ferrari started off this career with the fastest car and now they have the default second fastest one in the game. Yet, their car couldn't even be developed to be quicker than Haas's or Toro Rosso's. That didn't stop them beating Toro Rosso in the Constructors' Championship, as well as Racing Point, despite the fact Racing Point have the third quickest car on the grid and on a par to Mercedes. Racing Point probably would have finished higher up had Sainz stayed with the team for the whole season, as he served them much better than Hülkenberg did. The drivers certainly seem to have a big effect on the team's fortunes, almost big enough to counteract the actual performance of the car they're in. What's particularly strange is that Red Bull had the distinctly fastest car, yet weren't even close to beating McLaren. You may say it would have been different had I done all the races and not just simmed them, but that may be true. However, Leclerc for Renault won the Australian Grand Prix with Hülkenberg 2nd, Perez 3rd, Russell 4th, and even Hamilton wasn't too far off the pace as he finished in 5th. Gasly finished in 6th, which is about right for McLaren, but then again Kvyat finished in 7th in only the 6th best car on the grid, and Raikkonen scored a quarter of his yearly points in that one race. Bottas finished down in 10th with the supposed best car, and we can't even compare that to Verstappen since he retired. However, he only qualified in 7th, and even Gasly beat that. Also, let's not forget that sure, Leclerc is a fantastic driver and him winning isn't that out of the ordinary, but him doing so with only the 5th best car is extraordinary. Arguably an even greater achievement than Russell's 4th place in the 3rd slowest car. The young generation really have taken over Formula 1. I don't doubt the season would have ended differently had I done all the races, and Verstappen likely wouldn't even have won the championship, or certainly not in the dominant fashion he did. But if I did all the races, then going on the Australian Grand Prix, I still don't think the Constructors' Championship would have ended in an order that makes any more sense than the one we got. Thanks to the rule changes, most of the teams lost some of their performance-based upgrades, except Williams, who now have the 7th best car, Renault, who now have the 3rd best, and Racing Point, who now have the car to beat. Red Bull only dropped one position, but it's quite a big day for Formula 1, as the rule changes took the two original top teams, Mercedes and Ferrari, down to the very bottom of the running order. Mercedes have the worst car by far, whereas the once mighty Ferrari have the 2nd slowest car, but considerably better than Mercedes. In terms of driver changes, Albon and Hamilton will be teammates for the 3rd time in their careers, as they're now both at McLaren. Verstappen took Hamilton's seat to Mercedes, and Gasly will be partnering up with George Russell at Racing Point. Finally, Hülkenberg has joined a 6th different team in this career. He started off at Renault, then left them after half a season for Haas, before going to McLaren. Then he raced for Red Bull for half a season, then Racing Point for the second half of that same season, before finally joining Ferrari. Red Bull won the Australian Grand Prix and even got a 1-2 in China, despite the fact they had a worse car than Racing Point. But at the power circuit in Azerbaijan, Racing Point got a 1-2 with the fastest car on the grid. Then in the Spanish Grand Prix we saw another Red Bull 1-2 with Racing Point now nowhere for no good reason, as they finished the race in 4th and 14th. In Monaco, Racing Point's unexplained collapse continued as they only scored 2 points. Red Bull got another 1-2, Renault 3-4, Norris for Haas finished in 5th, and even McLaren got their drivers into 6th and 7th, with Ricciardo and the other Haas in 8th. Even Max Verstappen in a Mercedes scored a point, and they have the worst car on the grid. It wasn't until the French Grand Prix that Red Bull officially had a quicker car than Racing Point. 3 races later, Ferrari jumped up to 3rd in the vehicle performance chart, and 2 races after that, Mercedes outdeveloped Williams. Then, in the space of 2 races, Mercedes jumped up from having the 8th best car to the 3rd best, and even above Ferrari. Red Bull mathematically won the Constructors' Championship in Singapore with 6 races spare. In the USA, Valtteri Bottas became the 4th different driver to win a championship, and he did so with Red Bull, who were the team to beat this year. Both Red Bulls topped the table with Bottas beating Sainz by 77 points. Max Verstappen missed out on becoming a quadruple world champion by 136 points, with his former teammate Gasly scoring exactly 200 points and ending the season in 4th. Hülkenberg was by far the best performing Ferrari driver with over 100 points more than Raikkonen. Vettel, Raikkonen, Ricciardo and Hamilton were all beaten by their younger teammates. Sergio Perez, just 1 year after he thrashed Hamilton, was smashed by Verstappen. Kvyat was Toro Rosso's only point scorer, and Romain Grosjean was able to grab a point for Alfa Romeo, whereas Giovinazzi couldn't. Red Bull ended the season with more than double the points of Mercedes in 2nd. And let's not forget, Mercedes started this season with what was, supposedly, the slowest car. That's how quick Max Verstappen is and the power he has, as he almost single-handedly outscored Racing Point. Ferrari finished the season in 4th despite their slow start. Haas beat McLaren despite starting the season with the slower car, and they also got the better of Renault, who started and ended the season with a quicker car. For the second to last season there weren't any rule changes, but there were a total of 5 driver changes. Interestingly, Albon left McLaren even after besting Hamilton, when honestly if anyone was going to leave the team I thought it would have been Lewis. Maybe Hamilton used his influence to force him out. Whatever the behind the scenes story is, Raikkonen will partner up alongside the Brit, meaning McLaren have got the oldest driver lineup by far with a combined age of, by now, 88 years. George Russell will have a fantastic shot at winning his first title as he joins Red Bull, meaning Sainz has gone to Mercedes, which in turn means Perez has gone to Racing Point to take what was Russell's seat. Finally, Alexander Albon has joined Ferrari, and we'll have to see if he fares any better than Raikkonen did, which shouldn't be difficult. Red Bull won the Constructors' Championship in Brazil, and Bottas didn't quite take the driver's title. This is by far the closest battle we've had, but heading into Abu Dhabi, Bottas would need to score no points at all in the final race, whilst Verstappen would have to win and take the fastest lap in order to win the championship. The only part of that did come true was Verstappen winning the race, but Bottas finished in 3rd, meaning he's now a double world champion. 16 points separated Verstappen from Bottas come the end, and in the battle of number 2 drivers, Bottas' teammate Russell beat the other Mercedes driver of Sainz. Hülkenberg led a Ferrari 5-6, and Perez overtook Gasly in the standings at the last moment to lead a Racing Point 7-8. Vettel beat both Haas drivers as well as his teammate Leclerc. McLaren is the interesting one, as halfway into the season, Hamilton was ahead of Raikkonen, but in the second half of the season, Hamilton only scored 2 points. The finishing record speaks for itself. Hamilton had the better start to the season, but Raikkonen ended much stronger. The 2 Toro Rosso drivers and Giovinazzi for Alfa Romeo were the last to score points. The Constructors' Championship ended almost exactly the way it should, given how quick all the cars are, except that Ferrari beat Racing Point, despite the Italian team having the slower car. The same could be said in the battle between the two Italian teams of Alfa Romeo and Toro Rosso. Alfa had the quicker car, but scored a third the points Toro Rosso did. In terms of development, all the teams couldn't do anything since there wasn't a rule change heading into the season to reset a department or two. This is the continuing legacy of starting this career before version 1.09. The final round of driver changes involved Pierre Gasly going to Mercedes to partner up with Verstappen again, Perez leaving Racing Point to go to Haas, Magnussen joining his old teammate Grosjean at Alfa Romeo, and yet another original driver lineup is recreated as Sainz and Norris both joined Racing Point. Lance Stroll took Magnussen's old seat at Toro Rosso, which means Giovinazzi is out of F1. The Italian is the only driver apart from the Williams drivers to have never raced for another team in the entire 10-season long career. What I found very interesting is how many original driver lineups were restored throughout the career. Vettel and Leclerc are both at Renault, Verstappen and Gasly at Mercedes, Grosjean and Magnussen at Alfa Romeo, as well as Sainz and Norris at Racing Point. That doesn't even include the other original driver pairings that were reunited earlier in the career. The game does seem to like keeping teammates together and not even necessarily the original ones, as Hamilton and Albon were teammates for a number of different seasons and at 3 different teams. Whilst the car performance levels ended in the same order as they did last year, the rule change did offer some scope for teams to briefly make up a lot of positions. Alfa Romeo capitalised on the opportunity better than anyone else, as they had the quickest car for the Chinese Grand Prix. Not like the simulated race results suggest that, as Magnussen finished in 7th, with his teammate Grosjean way outside the points in 15th. In the Singapore Grand Prix, McLaren claimed a 4-5 with Hamilton beating Raikkonen and taking the fastest lap. Racing Point meanwhile finished in 14th and 15th, which makes no sense, given that McLaren only have the 7th best car and Racing Point the 3rd. Sure, Racing Point have the joint best power unit and McLaren the 3rd best chassis, which explains why they are good at circuits that suited their car's strengths. But you don't get cars specialised to that extent. I guess if the game bases the Italian Grand Prix results largely on the team's powertrain stat and the Singapore Grand Prix on their chassis stat, that could explain why Red Bull could only muster 8th and 10th at Monza. It also explains plenty of the more unusual results we saw in the previous seasons. Having said that, Williams have got the joint best engine but finished in 19th and 20th. Yet again, we're the exception to every rule. Mercedes having no real weaknesses, as they have the joint best powertrain, middling aero and the 2nd best chassis just behind Red Bull's, could explain how the German team won the Constructors' Championship in Mexico. One race later, Max Verstappen became a quadruple world champion. Verstappen outscored Bottas by 53 points come the end, with Gasly 3rd and Hülkenberg for Ferrari in 4th. Russell finished behind him in 5th, and then it's both Haas's, Norris, Hamilton, Sainz and Vettel before you get to the 2nd Ferrari driver of Albon. Leclerc and Magnussen both scored 16 points, and myself too, in what was a thrilling Australian Grand Prix, which will be covered in a separate video. Everyone else scored no points at all. Mercedes won the final Constructors' Championship in the career despite running a slower car than Red Bull, and Racing Point ended the season with the 3rd best car, yet finished the season 5th in the standings. McLaren had a mighty end to the season, largely thanks to Hamilton, who was somehow able to drag the 7th best car into the podium places twice. That meant McLaren beat Renault, who had the much better car. It almost seems like the drivers a team has are as vital to their success as their car. Hamilton and Verstappen are the best examples of it. Collectively, they won 7 of the 10 drivers' championships, and quite often they were able to win with cars that were up at the sharp end, but not quite at the very front. I mean, that's exactly what Verstappen did this year. Those two have the Midas touch, which no other driver seems to have to anywhere near the same extent. Lance Stroll seems to do the exact opposite, as Toro Rosso ended this year last in the Constructors and with 0 points. Sure, they had the second slowest car on the grid, but that didn't stop them scoring 6 points and finishing 8th in the championship in the previous season. That's the second time we've seen Lance Stroll join the team and totally destroy them. And that's it. 10 seasons completed. There's no fanfare or even a little message like you got at the end of the career mode on F1 2017. You simply end it in the same way you end every single season, get shown the credits, and that's it. It's a very forgettable end to what was an extremely memorable and bonkers 10 seasons. This career mode reminded me a lot of two previous F1 games, F1 2016 and F1 Manager. That may sound bad given that F1 2016 pales in comparison to the games that succeeded it, and F1 Manager is, objectively speaking, rubbish. But it's the fact that formerly midfield and backmarker teams such as Toro Rosso, Haas and McLaren rose up and had their moments in the spotlight. That reminded me of F1 2016. F1 2017's car development was so slow and boring that it couldn't happen on that game, and whilst F1 2018 improved it, it still didn't really allow the Formula 1 world to change drastically from how it starts out. Sure, the teams developed unrealistically quickly in this career mode, but I absolutely loved just watching it unfold. That constant level of intrigue was heightened to no end by the driver changes. It was like F1 Manager except, and I didn't think this was possible, with even less logic. Hamilton beat every teammate he ever had except Perez and Raikkonen. Although he did beat the Finn in the final season and ended the season as one of the quickest drivers despite the car he was given. Albon was eventually able to match Hamilton's pace when the two were at Mercedes, but the Thai driver was laughably behind Hülkenberg. Vettel was sometimes quicker than Leclerc, but sometimes Leclerc beat him by an enormous margin. There seems to be almost no consistency as to how quick each driver is, and no logic to the driver transfers that take place. But that's exactly why I love it. I can understand why some people would want it to be toned down a bit, so that the driver transfers make some degree of sense. And that's fine, and in fact Codemasters have supposedly bettered the logic of mid-season driver transfers, which is something I might investigate at a later date. But what I really hope is that they don't make the unexpected impossible. Anyway, that ends a career that saw Sebastian Vettel win the first season's Drivers' Championship, Lewis Hamilton win the next one with Mercedes, the one after that with Toro Rosso, and his third one with both Toro Rosso and Mercedes. After Hamilton's run, Verstappen took command and took 3 championships in a row with McLaren. Then Bottas got his time in the spotlight with 2 championships in a Red Bull, before Max Verstappen won his 4th championship with Mercedes-Benz. So I hope you guys liked this video and enjoyed watching those 10 seasons play out as much as I enjoyed going through them. And I'll see you soon for the 10 seasons of Australian Grand Prix videos where we relive those years and see just how well everyone did in proper action-packed races around the streets of Melbourne.